Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining this presentation. So today we're going to talk about how to build your QA framework. I'll have some time hopefully at the end to answer some questions, and so we'll go ahead and get started. So to kick things off first, actually what I'd love to do is start with a meditation from one of our meditation coaches, Afosu Jones-Corte. I'll talk more about Elevate Labs and our apps, but I wanted to start with this meditation because we found that these meditations really help bring focus and help recenter, especially if you've had a hectic day or if you've been in back-to-back meetings. A few housekeeping items. Feel free to keep your camera off. I'm going to turn mine off. You can mute yourself and just close your eyes and let Afosu guide you.
Hey everybody, it's Afosu. Why don't we take just a couple minutes to settle in and get some focus. I invite you first to just take a moment and notice where your feet are making contact with the surface beneath you. Just tuning into that feeling of support. And you can also notice what it feels like to be sitting if you're sitting, or standing if you're standing. Gently let your shoulders drop down away from your ears. And take a moment and guide your attention to your breathing. Just noticing what it feels like to breathe right now. In a moment, I'll ask you to breathe in for a count of 5 and breathe out for a count of 5. This is a nice way to bring some balance and clarity into our day. On your next inhale, breathe in for a count of 5. Let's do it together. Breathing in, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathing out, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathing in, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathing out, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do this on your own for the next 2 or 3 breaths. Just giving yourself permission to relax and be present every time you breathe out. And now, as we bring our meditation to a close, I'd like you to take a moment and just say something kind to yourself. What words of encouragement or motivation, forgiveness, or even love would be helpful for you to hear right now? Offer those words to yourself. All right. Take a deep breath in, breathing in, and breathing out. And if your eyes are closed, you can open them. And have a great meeting and a great rest of your day. Take care.
I hope you enjoyed that. We found that those are really helpful. We've done them before a couple meetings, and I found that it just really helps me, one, be more focused during the meeting and also just feel a little bit more relaxed. Alrighty. A little bit about me. I am the director of analytics at Elevate Labs, and I lead our data team. We went through a pretty massive infrastructure project, and part of it's still ongoing towards the end of last year, where we switched over our data stack. We were previously on Redshift, and then we cut over to what I'd say is like some best in class now. We use Fivetran for ingestion, Snowflake for our data warehouse. We're using dbt for all of our transformations and testing, which is going to be the focus for today. And then we use Looker for our BI. I was previously at PwC, Newsella, and Group 9. And when I was at PwC, I was really focused on anti-money laundering and forensic analytics, which is really what sort of honed me in on the realm of QA. I had one client where they were able to figure out a couple things, but basically what was happening was a rogue employee started writing checks to himself and then cashing those checks. And I bring that up as just an example where we were asked to basically tie every dollar to a vendor and then actually then confirm that vendor existed in order to get to that state. And it's something that's definitely near and dear to me. And I think since I've had to work with it since the outset of my career, it's something I think a lot about. Also, just as data practitioners, the most painful thing that can happen is if the data integrity starts to erode. And so that's one of the things where I've always had an interest in it, because it's one of the things that's definitely fixable. We just have to be on top of it. Oh, a couple of fun facts about me. My favorite restaurant that I've been to recently in the city is Thai Diner. It's located in Soho. It's delicious. Definitely recommend it. It's part of the same family that did Uncle Boone's Thai, which sadly closed during the pandemic. And then my favorite recent-ish hack in New York is that the New York Public Library, I did not discover that they offer Kindle books. I used to just go there every time I wanted a book. And then during the pandemic, I discovered that they do Kindle, which is so great because then you get it delivered right away to your device. So it's pretty awesome. All right. So a little bit about Elevate. So we've got two apps at Elevate. So we have Balance, which is the meditation that we just listened to by Afosu. That is where that meditation, more meditations like that would, and we're actually right now giving away a free year. So if you liked what you just heard and you're interested in some more meditations, we've got two great coaches, Afosu and another coach, Leah. You could download the app. It's free for right now for 1 year, and you can try out more meditation. We have another app called Elevate, and that was actually the first app in our portfolio. And these are like cognitive games that you can play just to continue to stay sharp and also just improve different skills around writing, punctuation, math, averages. I really like it. I've learned through this that I'm not so great at grammar. And so playing these games have really helped me get better at grammar. So a little bit about the initial state of our data. So when I started with Elevate, we were experiencing a laundry list of problems related to our data. And probably first and foremost, and arguably the largest issue was definitely around data integrity. Everything else on the list cascades down, but the biggest one was data integrity. And then as data practitioners, once that happens, people are very skeptical about anything that you'll show them. They'll also find ways to maybe circumvent the actual data, whether that's doing manual pulls from vendors or figuring out ways that they will use a different data set, which then in itself can create other problems. So when I started, we tried to initially work in what I'll call a repair mode and build some QA checks, but we just kept seeing a lot of issues kept getting flagged. Our code base was a bit antiquated, and some of the engineers that had set that up had left the company. And they were also at its core, they were software engineers. They were just asked to as a side hustle to build up some data infrastructure. So it was time for a revamp. I'm happy to talk more about what we did to revamp our data pipeline. It's not the focus for this conversation. I'll focus more on the QA, but if you're interested, I'm happy to chat about it. Here we go. So some of our challenges with our revenue data, so these are just some of the challenges that we were experiencing. Let me finish building this out. There we go. So some of the challenges that we were facing, these are definitely ones that I think are pretty common across the industry. I'll say some of the biggest ones for us was definitely time zone inconsistencies. So I'm located in New York, but our company pre-pandemic was based out of San Francisco. And so a lot of our data was being converted sometimes actually making into our warehouse. So there was really no way to reverse out of it unless we did a manual calculation, but being converted over to PST. And then some data was in UTC. So we were just a little bit all over the place. One of the things that we definitely wanted to do is just convert everything over to UTC. And then basically from there, we could change it around depending on what time zone was needed for what types of analyses we were looking at. We had capitalization mismatches. So in one table, iOS being all lowercase, in another table, iOS where the I was lowercase and the OS was capital. And then as a join, the join was not always functioning as we expect. The biggest thing that we were experiencing was around our revenue data. And this was just a huge pain point for us. We have 2 apps and they're available in both Apple and Android. And so we receive payments from Apple and Google. And the payments that we were receiving for Apple and Google did not reconcile with our own internal revenue data. And so you could think of, for several reasons, that was hugely problematic. For example, our marketing team weren't able to actually accurately see our return on ad spend or our ROAS. When we A/B tested, there was always some questions around the validity of the monetization metrics because we just weren't pulling in revenue correctly. So these were some of the impacts of the issues. Our marketing teams started scaling back efforts. There's lack of clear ownership when an issue was falling, whether whose side that falls within, if it's data engineering, software engineering, if it's with one of our vendors. We were definitely experiencing data trust erosion, also just constantly in firefighter mode, which then basically detracted us from a more impactful or more strategic work that we could be doing for the company. Our A/B tests were questionable. Revenue loss, and we couldn't even necessarily quantify what the revenue loss was because our revenue data was just coming in accurately. Yeah, and this was also just a huge distraction for a lot of the teams that were impacted by this. I think I had that one already. All right. But the good news is a lot of these things are fixable. And it makes sense. When you buy a house, you'll never just buy a house directly. You'll buy a house and then you'll have an inspector assess for damage and that before you actually decide to go through on the house. And it's a similar concept in data. We need to inspect our data first before actually pushing it to production and before making any major changes to the data, just to make sure that we're working with a sturdy foundation. This house right here, I learned this as I was putting this together and I was just Googling houses. This is the front of the house and this is the back. And the term for this is a house mullet, which is where the front of the house is a bit more traditional and then the back of the house is more modern. So benefits of a QA framework. The biggest thing for us was trust in our data. By and large, by starting to QA our own data, QA it from our vendors to make sure we're receiving values we would expect. We were able to start just building more trust in our data. Also, another cool thing that came out of this is that we were able to detect anomalies. So a good example of this is on our growth team. We were with one of our vendors, we saw that we were getting some erroneous data from them and we were getting inconsistent formats. And this was something that then was impacting the growth team and not only the dashboards that they provide, but it was also just bad data that we were getting from the vendor itself. And so in instances like this, we were able to be more proactive with the vendor and actually then work with them to update the data itself. There's also just a lot less fear when you're pushing an update to production when you have more tests in place that there's other things that are not going to break along. So types of tests. So the way that we thought about this is we thought about this in 2 types of buckets, practical tests and logical tests. And depending on the size and composition of your team, practical tests can be owned by data engineers and logical tests can be owned by analytic engineers or data analysts. At Elevate, we're a small company. We're about 40 people in total, and our data team is extremely lean. So the way that we do it at our company is that for the most part, our data engineer will work on practical tests, and then data analytics will own the logical tests. We don't actually have any analytic engineers at the company. Our data analysts are flexing between an analytics engineer and a data analyst. So a little bit more about practical tests. So what are practical tests? So practical tests aim to test for completeness of the data and the accurate data type. So you can think of this as checking for full data coverage, checking for standardized currency, and making sure that when you upload a data set, the header isn't appearing as a row, making sure that if you want country data in 2-letter codes, it's coming in 2-letter codes versus 3-letter codes. And I'll make it very clear for Elevate, and especially, and I think this is for most companies, we have a lot of data. We're definitely probably as large as some other companies, but even for us, it's not feasible for us to test every column in a table. So one of the things that we did is we had to work with stakeholders to better understand their requirements, one, on what things should look like, And then two, like, what are the most critical fields for them? And some of it was just, like, this is definitely a great example where it was trial and error. So like enough thing, like if we saw a field breaking and a stakeholder was bringing it up often enough to us, then that was going to be an example where we were going to basically implement some sort of testing in there. So it's a little bit of both. Like the way that we did it at Elevate was a bit of both. There were some fields, like in our revenue table, I was able to just basically say like the amount fields are definitely things that we want to make sure we have correct, and a couple other ones. If somebody on a different team tells me like, hey, like we really need to make sure that the cost data always comes through in proper formats, that's something that we'll then implement. Or if we get a question often enough, we'll just put a test in there so that way we can more proactively see if we're not getting data as we would expect from a partner or from a. So how we do some of our practical tests. So these are real examples that we've done just to basically clean up some of our data. And I'll say pretty much all of these was basically through trial and error, or basically we weren't doing this and we had joins were breaking, or vendors were sending us data in different formats and data sets were coming through incomplete, that we basically wanted to put in some of these practical tests. A great example is actually this one, this long form alphanumeric identifiers. So for us, that are all lowercase, that translates to the device IDs that we get from Apple and Android. And so we had one vendor that basically takes all the device IDs and they capitalize it. And then we have other vendors that will lowercase them. And then we have other vendors that they'll both uppercase and lowercase them. And so this was just a great example of like where we didn't necessarily go back to the vendors to have them change it. We just had to basically write something on top of the data that we would get to clean this. And then we wrote a test to make sure that it's all in one format. Because when we were doing joins, the joins were actually working because there were different formats that we were getting, but it was incomplete data. So that's like a great example where it was definitely more by mistake or I would say more by trial and error that we figured that one out. But that's one example of a practical test that we were doing. Another one, let's see, it's another good one to call out here. Yeah, every refund has their price in USD zeroed out and the product price in USD not zeroed out. So for us, this means if a customer makes a purchase and let's just say the next month they may refund. What that means for us is this field that we have called price in USD, it would get zeroed out to basically reflect the refund. But then we have this other field called product price in USD, and that should never be zeroed out. That should always be the actual price of what the customer paid. And so we had seen examples where the product price in USD was being zeroed out, and that was then impacting the way that we would calculate our revenue. So that's just like another example of a practical test that we wanted to put in to catch those types of things. Next are logical tests. So logical tests are a little bit, I would say, are definitely like the more fun part. So I think like the really cool thing about logical tests is it's as you're doing them, you get a much better macro understanding of the business, and you get to talk to a lot more stakeholders. Because I think this practical tests are the things that may sit more with the data team, but logical tests are a great opportunity just to talk to a lot of people and understand what are some of the things that they're looking out for and what are some of the things that they would expect to see in the data, but they're not necessarily a hard and fast rule. Like you need to understand the data and look at it in some sort of way to understand if there is something that looks like it's an anomaly. When you're looking for these types of logical tests, it's also important to talk to the stakeholder. So like, and understand like from a stakeholder's perspective, is directional accuracy okay? Or do you need complete accuracy? So like an example being finance teams, I've found like they need exact accuracy versus like maybe a product team, like directional accuracy is just okay. And so it's really important when you're doing these logical tests to find like what that is. We'll talk more about it, but DBT has the testing framework. And in that testing framework, you can allow for some room for discrepancies, or you can allow for no discrepancies. And when you do that, and when you set those thresholds, it's really important to understand if you want the directional accuracy or if you want complete accuracy. And these are just examples of some of the logical tests that we did that we're either doing right now or working to implement. So one that I'll call out here is 2 sample sizes in the experiment should be within 1% of each other. What we were seeing before is that when we would do an A/B experiment, one group would always be a little bit larger than the other group. And it was enough to like then shift the metrics that we were looking at. And so this is like a test that the data will report with what we actually see, but this was something that we worked with our product teams on to basically capture this if it's happening and at least inform them, because then they'll make some decisions on their end if an experiment needs to be re-architected in some way so that the sample sizes are more even with one another. Let's see. Some of our logical tests here, so a user shouldn't be in the experiment and the control of the same experiment. So we've put in some tests around that. A user can't complete more than one meditation at the same exact timestamp. So one of the things that I think it's inevitable with all event data, like you will see duplicate data that comes through, and they'll come through within milliseconds of each other. So this is one of the things that we wanted to put in as we start to look at like user activity, that it just doesn't make sense for a user to complete one meditation at the same exact timestamp. And we put some other thresholds as we looked at the data to figure out, like, also it probably doesn't make sense that a user completed 100 meditations in one day. So what are those thresholds that we wanted to put? One thing that I'll call out here is that logical tests are definitely distinct than alerts. And so alerts are definitely important and probably will come up as part of this conversation especially when you're talking to stakeholders. They'll say, oh, I'd love to know about X, Y, and Z if this is happening. Really I would separate that conversation out and say that's part of alerts. And so examples of alerts could be like app ratings going above or below a certain threshold, revenue spiking, cost is increasing in a certain function. So how DBT can help with testing. So DBT out of the box has this DBT test framework, and this is what we use to basically set up all of our tests. So you can run all these tests locally before you push anything to production to make sure that all of your tests are actually passing. And it's really simple. The framework is DBT test. I'm sure actually Brooklyn Data probably has more style guides on how you should manage your testing scripts. We very simply, we just have like folder structures that's just compare like A to B. So it's one data set to another data set. And then within that folder, we'll have several scripts that are then comparing those two data sets to one another. And so like an example being like, if we wanted to basically run a test where we have revenue, let's just say in table A, and then we have revenue also in table B. And when we aggregate both up by the month, they should be the same thing. So like in that example, it'd be compare A to B, and then we would have a few checks then within that folder. So the folder would be called compare A to B. Then within that folder, we would do row if they were at the same detailed level, but we would definitely look at revenue. We would look at distinct dates. We would look at things like that and have at least probably 2 or 3 tests within that folder to make sure that revenue, which was just one field between these two tables, are the same. Cool. So how Elevate uses DBT testing. So we talked about this a little bit. We've got over 100 tests in production, and we are trying to create more. Because of the fast pace that we're moving at, since we cut over our data infrastructure, I'll say we're doing this a little bit reverse order, where sometimes we're pushing out things to production. And then unfortunately, once something breaks, we'll go back through and make some tests. It's not the ideal way. Sometimes that does happen. And the ideal state that we want to get to is basically create these tests before we push anything to production. Let's see what else. Things will break and you'll find issues, and that's actually a good thing. It's better to find that issue before you push it out to production, and that way you can dive a little bit deeper into what's happening and continue before pushing out to production. Some tips. So these are just some tips of like things to keep in mind when you're putting together tests. So use a linter. I like to use the is prefixes, but I'm sure that there's probably more code guidelines out there that will give you a little bit more cleaner way of writing the test. But I just like using that, so that way it's a little bit true. It's cleaner to read if a question is like a true false question. As more people enter the organization, your QA program will become more and more important, because you're going to be having more and more people pushing to your production. So definitely try to build that out. And then I'd say the last thing is, if you have more than one source of truth for a metric, that's actually a great thing to use to bump up against one another. So like an example being like you calculate revenue internally, but then you also get revenue, maybe detailed payment information from a vendor, and you want to make sure that those two are within, let's say, 1% of each other. That's actually a great thing to have, because then you can be even more certain of your data. I'm going to run through these last couple slides a little bit faster. I'm just looking at the time now. So roles and responsibilities, I would definitely have this fleshed out. So depending on the size of your company, like these things could all live with different people. So who's responsible for actually monitoring that something was flagged? Who's responsible for then actually correcting the issue? Who is going to communicate that there is an issue? And maybe inform other stakeholders. And then who's the stakeholder? Who's the one that like maybe driving the need for a test in of itself? So these are good things to flush out. I'll say for us, like we were flagging issues and then we weren't necessarily correcting them. And so there's something to be said that's like definitely helpful to know it, but you definitely want to make sure you're correcting it. And then you also want to make sure you're communicating it out. And that's definitely an area where we needed to improve upon at Elevate, was flag the issue, actually correct it, and then actually communicate this to the folks that would be impacted. Ask stakeholders. So this is a great way to learn about the business. I found that if you just ask like an open-ended question, sometimes it's too much for a stakeholder to process exactly what you need. I would think about a survey or maybe offer suggestions of things that you could look at. For Elevate, this includes there are users in more than one subscription group. We see our revenue spiking or dipping. We see no refunds or purchases happening within a certain day. If we saw any of these things, these would definitely be a case for alarm and things that we needed to look deeper into to see if that's happening on our data feed side or if there's actually something happening at the company. Summary. So we know we definitely have made some mistakes along the way, and I hope that this will help. If you're looking to set up a QA program, this will help you learn a couple of the things where we definitely failed and we needed to improve on. There's two types of tests, the practical and the logical tests. I also really recommend the DBT testing framework. I'll say that for us, that was really easy to use out of the box. You can, if you're only updating, let's say 3 tables, you can just have the test run for those 3 tables. So you don't need to run every single test that you've created, which makes it really easy to do that, to use DBT testing. Clarify roles and responsibilities within your team and with stakeholders so that folks know who's responsible for flagging, who's responsible for communicating, and who's responsible for correcting things. Oh, we're hiring too. Sorry. So that wraps up this portion of the QA thing. If this is interesting to you, we're hiring for a senior data analyst and a data analyst position. I'm open on both the DBT Slack and I'm also on the Locally Optimistic Slack. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. We also have other positions at the company too, if you're interested in the work that we're doing. These are just a couple of the positions that we have, but I would definitely check out our careers page if any of this sounds interesting to you.
Amazing. Thank you, Sonia. That was great. It's really exciting to see the QA and testing journey that that you've gone through. I know I remember when I first started using DBT test and just testing in general was just like this kind of paradigm shift from like me having these SQL queries I would just run periodically to see if things were working or have a report that I would check to actually having tests. And it's really cool to see the journey that you went on through as a team.